Sometimes you hear people say, well, whoever wins the popular vote should win. And if there's more people in the cities, if they win the popular vote, then that's just the way it is. And who cares about the farmers? There is no other segment of society that we would just look at them and say, your needs are unimportant. We can outvote you. We don't strive for simple, bare majorities and then just tell everybody else, tough, it doesn't matter. What we are striving for and what the Constitution sets up and what our founders wanted is justice and fairness and protection of liberty.
Sometimes we hear a serious objection to the Electoral College, lodged on the grounds that the Electoral College was designed by the Constitutional Convention to protect slavery. And the reasoning runs like this. The Electoral College is composed of representatives from every state based on your number of members in the House of Representatives and your number of senators. Well, isn't that a revelation? Because in that case, that means that for the purpose of representation, southern states could count their slaves who otherwise were not permitted any voice in the political process, towards their representatives, and those representatives would therefore pile up in the Electoral College, and there would be an artificial bonus given to slaveholding states to cast votes in favor of pro-slavery policies. And thus, the Electoral College, designed to operate by the Constitutional Convention for the interests of slavery. And a great aha moment erupts at that point. The difficulty is that it is an aha moment with no air in the balloon. In 1787, all of the states, not just the southern states, excepting alone Massachusetts, legalized slavery. There was no bonus paid by the Electoral College to slave-owning states versus free states. All the states enjoyed that bonus. The largest slaveholding state in the Union in 1787 was Virginia. The largest northern slaveholding state, New York.
The 3/5 compromise is not created for the Electoral College. It is created for the House of Representatives. The founders need to figure out, how do you represent the people and the states? Well, already built into the system is the representation for the House, the representation for the Senate. All they do is say, that math has already been vetted, it has already been through the compromise. The North is agreeing with it, the South agrees with the West, and the East agree with it. We agree with that, that is the great compromise. We will build that into the presidency.
When the Electoral College is finally determined upon as a mechanism for electing the president, the question of slavery never entered into the consideration because it wouldn't have had any application. There was no Electoral College advantage for slaveholding states because in 1787 they were all slaveholding states. 25 years later, that's going to change as northern states, one by one, move into the non-slaveholding column. But the members of the Constitutional Convention weren't writing the Constitution with a view towards saying, aha, 25 years from now, we know that there will be a bonus for slaveholding states in the Electoral College. Well, yes, there was, but it was a temporary one. It was already ebbing away by the time Abraham Lincoln is elected.
Proponents of that argument have decided that if they tarnish the institution of the Electoral College with racism, then that automatically means it is suspect and needs to be replaced. But it's just ahistorical, it's not accurate, and it's not really honest, frankly.
Charging the Electoral College as an institution for slavery really delegitimizes the plight of African Americans for generations. But it also completely ignores history. If you look at the kinds of people that were advancing the causes, what did people like Frederick Douglass say? They said that ultimately these systems actually were helping bring about the freedom of slaves, that they were resulting in the ability for slaves to overcome their oppressors in the South. Yes, nobody can argue that some of the founders had slaves, some of them didn't. Slavery was very common in our world. It was wrong. But it was the United States of America that actually created a system that ultimately resulted in it being eradicated.
And so now, guess what? People that look like me aren't considered 3/5 of a human being. People that look like me have the ability to vote. Black people are now fully vested members of society in spite of the inequalities that we still face today. When we're talking about, do you have the right to vote? The Electoral College has no bearing on that.
So for example, if you think about it, There's about 130 million people that voted in the last presidential election. Of that 130 million, the number is about 35 million minorities. If you move to a system where you eliminate the Electoral College, literally the United States of America could be won at one time by just white people. That's hardly a system that promotes the diversity that exists, not just among races, not just among preferences about what partners people want to have, but also in careers and how people want to make their living.
The Electoral College forces people to sort of make the compromises necessary to not just appeal to a couple of big blocks, but to take into account these smaller blocks of voters. I mean, that's very similar to a point that Vernon Jordan was making in the late 1970s. The Electoral College ensures that racial minorities have representation by being sort of the tipping point in a number of states and are able to influence which direction that state's electoral votes go.
What purpose would there be for a candidate to appeal to the interests of African American voters if in a national popular vote, African American voters amount to only 7% of those casting votes? Not really all that significant, so you pay no attention to African American voters. In the Electoral College system, you do have to pay attention to African American voters because in a number of key swing states, African American voters are an important component of the voting public, and you had better have something important to say for African American voters to hear, or you lose their votes. When you lose their votes, you lose that state, you lose that swing state, you lose the Electoral College.
If you're a candidate for president, it is impossible to get elected president without black people voting for you. Now, you can say the Republicans have won elections, but they have found ways to get black people to vote for them. Not a lot, but enough, right? You cannot get elected president of the United States without support in the Latino community. You can say, well, Republicans haven't gotten a lot of Latino support, but guess what? They have gotten enough. And so when you take away the Electoral College, you create a scenario where people can get elected president of the United States without a single vote cast in their name by a single minority. That is the reality that we need to be facing. So if you're sitting here saying that it is right for someone to get elected who hates minorities abjectly and concretely, well, then you should be terrified of an America that does not have an Electoral College. The legacy of black people in America is well documented. We've had times in America when we've had no rights. We have even modern day society when many of the rights that we should enjoy freely still seem as if they come with strings attached. So that is a very serious thing that we should, number one, acknowledge, and number two, still confront in our regular lives when it comes to, again, building a more perfect America. But when you talk about how do we get to that more perfect union, how do we make sure that we are living Dr. King's dream, that all people are judged by the content of their character? You don't do it by, again, getting rid of the one thing that has empowered black people to be able to leverage political power. We can have arguments about are there presidents who are hostile to the interests of certain communities. What we're not talking about is a scenario where somebody who got 18% of the vote ends up becoming president of the United States. But we have never had a president in the modern era who has campaigned to take away rights of Americans, actually rights enshrined in the Constitution. That is a scenario that we could end up confronting in a world where we have gotten rid of the Electoral College.
In the election of 1860, we had 3 separate parties, 4 if you count the splinter party. The candidate who won that election did not win a majority in the popular vote. The candidate of the Republican Party, in that case, actually won only 39.9% of the popular vote. Yet, that candidate won a significant majority in the Electoral College. And so, that candidate was duly elected President of the United States. Now, you might say, yes, but it wasn't a popular election. Yes, that candidate wasn't elected by all the people. That's right, that candidate wasn't, but his name was Abraham Lincoln.
There is no Emancipation Proclamation without the Electoral College, because without the Electoral College, there is no Abraham Lincoln as President of the United States of America.
And while his total percentage was the lowest of any elected president, he was actually the most popular sort of national candidate to the extent we had one in that election in which the country was very divided. Lincoln was the candidate who won in New England, he won in the mid-Atlantic states, he won in the Midwest, he won in the Prairie, he won in the new states on the West Coast. He was the most national candidate of the group, and we were very fortunate at that point that the Electoral College had given us Lincoln rather than Stephen Douglas or candidate of the Deep South slaveholders, John Breckinridge.
The question for Black Americans, the questions for minority communities should be, how do we get more boxes checked? How do we get to a point where both parties are now accountable and responsive? Because that is how you ultimately get to a place where the solutions for Black and brown people all across this great land start to accelerate. And that should happen irrespective of who's in power. The founding ethos of the Black Congressional Caucus, whether you're a Democrat or not, was that Black people have no permanent friends and they have no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And Black people in America have made permanent friends of the Democratic Party, permanent enemies of the Republican Party, and our permanent interests have been cast aside. And so, if you're really, truly focused on empowering Black communities, let's not sit here and talk about eliminating the Electoral College. Let's really focus on how do we as people leverage the power that we have in mass, in numbers, and by law, and part of that is through the Electoral College.
says. It's not a purpose.